The smell of burning wisdom fills the morning air. Theon of Alexandria presses his back against the marble wall of the Serapeum's inner sanctum, watching 300 years of collected human knowledge crackle into ash, while boots thunder up the steps outside. In his weathered hands, hands that have copied Ptolemy's star charts and corrected Euclid's geometric proofs, he clutches the last complete copy of Aristotle's Constitution of Athens, the papyrus still warm from the reading table, where he abandoned his morning's work when the shouting began. Through the high windows, dawn light filters through smoke rising from a dozen fires throughout Alexandria's streets. The mob has been gathering since before sunrise, their voices joining in hymns that transform into war cries as they surge toward the temple that has stood as humanity's memory for longer than any of them have drawn breath. What began as another theological dispute has become something darker, hungrier, more final. Welcome to the story that will redefine everything you thought you knew about the fall of the ancient world. If you're settling in for history's greatest intellectual catastrophe and ready to discover why we're still living with the consequences, thank you for watching. And if you want more ancient stories like this to accompany your quiet hours, subscribe, because this is just the first day of a story that changed human civilization forever. Theon. The voice cuts through the crackling flames like a blade through silk. Theon of Alexandria, come out and face God's judgment. It is Ammonius, the stone thrower, a dock worker whose calloused hands have found new purpose hurling rocks at pagan temples and Jewish synagogues. Yesterday, he counted coins for honest labor. Today, he serves Archbishop Theophilus by destroying what took lifetimes to create. Behind him come the Parabolani, the Christian street fighters who take their name from their supposed mission to care for the sick but have transformed into righteousness made flesh, carrying iron bars wrapped in leather, crude weapons blessed by priests who quote scripture about cleansing temples. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. These men cannot read the books they're burning. Theon knows these faces. 3 days ago, he bought fish from Ammonius's brother at the harbour market. Last week, he treated a Parabolani's fevered child with medicines prepared from texts in this very library. Now they come for him with the terrible certainty of converts who have found their purpose in other men's destruction, transforming neighbours into heretics with the alchemy of absolute faith. The old librarian looks around the reading room that has been his world for 40 years. Wooden shelves stretch from floor to ceiling, each level packed with scrolls that contain humanity's attempts to understand itself and the cosmos that cradles it. Here rest the medical treatises of Herophilus, who first mapped the human pulse and described surgery on living brains. There lie the engineering manuals of Ctesibius, whose steam engines and water clocks represent technologies that will not appear again for over 1,000 years. But fire makes no distinction between genius and mundane, between irreplaceable and merely rare. The flames that leap from shelf to shelf consume indiscriminately, reducing Archimedes' lost works on mechanics to the same ash that claims a merchant's grain inventory. 3 centuries of careful collection, copying, and preservation become fuel for a conflagration fed by ideology rather than accident. This is not about Christianity versus paganism. This is about what happens when certainty becomes more valuable than curiosity, when faith demands the destruction of questions it cannot answer. Theon moves with practiced efficiency through the chaos, his scholar's mind calculating impossible mathematics. What can be saved versus what must be abandoned? The complete works of Menander, 400 plays that chronicle human folly with wit that makes gods weep, or the surgical manuals of Antyllus, whose brain operations will not be rediscovered until the Renaissance. The astronomical observations of Hipparchus, who catalogued 850 stars, or the historical chronicles of Manetho, who preserved 3,000 years of Egyptian dynastic records. Every choice damns a dozen masterpieces to ash. Theon stuffs scrolls into his leather satchel with the desperation of a man trying to carry an ocean in a wine cup. Apollonius's Conics, the mathematical treatise that describes orbital mechanics 18 centuries before Kepler, goes in beside a medical text detailing cataract surgery techniques that European doctors will not rediscover until the 1600s. 3 scrolls from 400,000. The bronze doors of the inner sanctum buckle under axes wielded by men who cannot read the inscriptions they destroy. Peter the Reader, an ironic title for a man who leads book-burning expeditions, pushes through the splintered wood with a torch that illuminates his scarred face like a demon fresh from hell's forge. His followers stream behind him like water through a broken dam, their voices raised in psalms that transform into shouts of triumph. "Behold how the heathen wisdom burns," Peter declares, thrusting his torch toward a shelf of astronomical texts. "See how Apollo's lies crumble before Christ's truth." The papyrus catches instantly 3 centuries of celestial observations, the patient work of men who stayed awake through thousands of nights to map heaven's movements, transforming into smoke that makes the destroyer's eyes water, even as they cheer their victory over the universe itself. With a thunderous crash, bronze doors give way, unleashing men intoxicated by zeal, their clubs wrecking the tables that once supported humanity's finest scholars. They destroy what they cannot comprehend, eliminate questions they cannot answer, cleanse the world of complexity that threatens the beautiful simplicity of absolute faith. But Theon is no longer there to witness this theological celebration. The old scholar has vanished through a passage known only to the library's inner circle, a tunnel that connects the Serapeum to catacombs beneath Alexandria's streets. His footsteps echo in darkness, older than Christianity, older than Rome, older than the dream that built this impossible city where all knowledge might live forever. Behind him, the great statue of Serapis crashes to the marble floor with the sound of worlds ending. 30 feet of gold and ivory, the god who protected Alexandria's wisdom for 7 centuries, shatters into fragments that will be melted down for coins or ground to powder for mortar. The crash echoes across the city like thunder, announcing to every citizen that the old world, the world of questions instead of answers, inquiry instead of orthodoxy, preservation instead of purification, has died. Something new has taken its place, something that measures truth by faith instead of evidence, that finds wisdom through forgetting rather than remembering, that believes the greatest service to God is the destruction of human understanding. The flames climb higher, visible now from ships in the harbor, their smoke column rising into morning sky like incense from civilization's funeral pyre. Ship captains don't yet understand that the beacon guiding them toward Alexandria's port is actually humanity's greatest treasure, transformed into history's most expensive bonfire. Students abandon their studies to save their lives. Teachers watch decades of accumulated learning transform into ash that the wind scatters across streets where philosophy once walked in daylight but now flees in darkness. Scribes who spent their lives copying texts flee with whatever they can carry, becoming refugees from their own dedication to preserving what others created. As Theon emerges into Alexandria's narrow harbor streets, clutching his satchel of rescued wisdom, he turns for one last look at the building that has been his life's work. Through windows that once welcomed scholars from across the Mediterranean, he sees only fire dancing where thought once reigned. The Serapeum burns like a torch against the morning sky, its destruction marking the end of an age when collecting knowledge mattered more than enforcing belief. In his leather bag rest 3 scrolls, all he could save from humanity's greatest collection. Behind him, 400,000 others feed flames tended by men who believe ignorance is holiness. The Parabolani dance around the burning shelves, celebrating the murder of memory itself. But this was not the first time Alexandria burned. To understand what died in those flames, what humanity lost when ideology conquered inquiry, when preservation became crime, when learning became witchcraft, we must return to when men believed they could capture infinity itself between covers of books. We must go back to when a dying king's dream of endless conquest became a living city's dream of endless comprehension, when the world was young enough to think that all knowledge could fit in one place, waiting for minds wise enough to understand what the cosmos was trying to teach. They were wrong, but their magnificent failure created something so beautiful, so audacious, so tragically ambitious, that its destruction changed the course of human history. This is the story of the day knowledge died, and it begins with Alexander's last breath. At the deathbed of the world's greatest conqueror, generals gather close, circling like vultures cloaked in armor. Alexander of Macedon lies in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, his body racked by fever that has burned for 11 days, while his empire, stretching from Macedonia to India, larger than any realm in human memory, holds its breath. Around his bed stand the men who carved kingdoms from the corpses of Persian armies, who crossed mountains that touched the sky, who followed him to the edge of the world and would have followed him farther if he had asked. But Alexander is no longer asking. He can barely speak above a whisper, his golden hair dark with sweat, his legendary strength reduced to the effort required to draw each labored breath. The physicians, Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, have exhausted their arts treating the king. Some mutter about poison, others about divine punishment for a mortal who dared to claim godhood. None will say what they all know. The conqueror who conquered the world cannot conquer death. Ptolemy, son of Lagus, leans forward as Alexander's cracked lips move with desperate purpose. The king, who gave orders that reshaped continents, now struggles to form words that will determine which of his companions inherits the earth itself. When Perdiccas demands to know the king's chosen heir, the dying conqueror's eyes fix on something beyond the painted walls, beyond the hanging gardens, beyond the borders of the known world. Alexander's mouth opens, closes, opens again. The sound that emerges is barely human, more breath than voice, but every man in the room strains to catch word that will launch 1,000 wars. To the strongest, Alexander whispers, not to Perdiccas, his regent, not to Craterus, his most trusted general, not to any obvious choice. To the strongest means whoever can take the empire and hold it against all comers. Ptolemy watches Alexander's chest rise and fall with increasing irregularity, while his mind races through possibilities that would have seemed impossible hours ago. The Macedonian conqueror built his empire through conquest, but Ptolemy understands that holding it will require something more subtle than sword work. It will require legitimacy, the kind that comes not from strength alone, but from wisdom, from being seen as the rightful heir to the conqueror's glory. Alexander's breathing stops, starts, stops again. The silence stretches until Perdiccas places his hand on the royal throat, feeling for a pulse that no longer beats. The empire Alexander built through brotherhood fractures instantly along lines of ambition, drawn in blood and gold. Eyes that moments ago showed grief now calculate advantage. Hands that rested on sword hilts now grip them with purpose. But Ptolemy's eyes remain fixed on the still face, remembering not the conqueror, but the boy who once wept over Homer's Iliad because there were no more worlds to explore. That boy dreamed of immortality through deeds that would echo through eternity. He achieved it through conquest, but Ptolemy sees a different path to forever. While the others argue about armies and territories, Ptolemy makes a decision that will birth the greatest library in human history. He will not just seize territory. He will steal Alexander himself. The funeral procession begins 2 years later, winding from Babylon toward Macedonia, with the royal body preserved in honey and gold, housed in a sarcophagus that took Babylonian craftsmen months to complete. The coffin rolls through desert and mountain on a hearse more magnificent than most temples. Golden columns supporting a vaulted roof, studded with jewels that catch sunlight like captured stars. The preserved king lies inside like a god in his shrine, waiting to be entombed in the land that gave him birth. The procession never reaches Macedonia. At Damascus, Ptolemy strikes with the precision of a surgeon and the audacity of a pirate. His soldiers surround the funeral convoy, while the official escort finds itself outnumbered 3-1. The hijacking of history's most famous corpse begins without a single sword being drawn. When Aridaeus, the officer appointed to escort the god king home, demands justification, Ptolemy dismounts from his horse with the calm of a man who has calculated every possible outcome. The soul of a king belongs to the gods, Ptolemy declares across the Syrian desert, but his body belongs to the city that will honor him best. Macedonia is his home, Aridaeus protests. Egypt will be his immortality, comes the reply. Ptolemy has grasped something the other successors missed, that possessing the royal body means more than owning a corpse. It means inheriting the mantle of divine authority, the legitimacy that comes from being chosen by the gods to guard their son's eternal rest. But his vision extends beyond mere political theatre. As Ptolemy orders his men to redirect the funeral procession southward toward the Nile, his mind already sees the city that does not yet exist. Alexandria, where the royal tomb will stand at the heart of something unprecedented in human history. Not just another royal capital, but a living monument to human knowledge, a place where all wisdom might gather under the protection of the God King's eternal watch. Ptolemy understands that the dead conqueror can serve the living world better than any living successor, not through war, but through the library that will rise around his grave. The sarcophagus changes direction, like destiny itself pivoting on golden wheels. Instead of rolling toward Macedonia's hills, it turns toward Egypt's deserts, carrying the preserved king toward a tomb that will become the foundation stone of humanity's greatest attempt to collect all knowledge in one place. Beside the hearse rides an ambitious general, retracing the paths the Macedonian hero knew in life, only this time with a changed intent. The king who conquered the world through war will conquer eternity through the library that will rise around his grave. A library that will preserve not just Greek wisdom, but the learning of every civilization his armies encountered. From Persian mathematics to Babylonian astronomy, from Egyptian medicine to Indian philosophy, every current finds its way to Alexandria, merging like tributaries into a vast river, summoned by the royal aura and the Egyptian belief that true immortality is written in books, not battles. The funeral procession rolls south through Syrian wasteland, while behind them, Perdiccas gathers armies to reclaim what was stolen. And ahead of them, Egypt waits to receive the gift that will transform it from province to paradise. In the desert heat of 321 BC, the son of Lagus has set in motion forces that will create humanity's greatest collection of knowledge by stealing humanity's greatest hero. 3 centuries later, Julius Caesar will stand before the royal sarcophagus in the tomb library that this theft made possible, marveling at the preserved features of the man who conquered more of the world than any Roman has yet managed. Caesar will touch the golden coffin with trembling hands. Whether from reverence or ambition, history cannot say. The body will survive the encounter. The books will not. But that catastrophe lies in Alexandria's future. For now, the hearse carries more than a corpse toward Egypt. It carries the seed of a dream that will grow into something magnificent, tragic, and ultimately doomed. The strongest, the dying king said. The Egyptian will prove his strength not through conquest, but through preservation. Not by destroying knowledge, but by collecting it. Not by burning books, but by building the greatest library the world has ever seen. The Macedonian wanted to live forever. His general will make that possible in ways the dead conqueror could never have imagined. Captain Menander's ship is overtaken by harbour guards who descend like tax gatherers, cloaked in divine sanction and imperial authority. Menander of Rhodes watches in disbelief as Ptolemaic soldiers swarm across his trading vessel's deck, their bronze-tipped spears gleaming in Alexandria's morning sun, while they systematically ransack cargo that has never seen a customs inspection this thorough. His ship carried olive oil and wine from the Greek islands, pottery from Corinth, silver from Athenian mines, honest goods for honest trade. But the guards ignore amphoras and coin pouches, focusing instead on a single wooden chest that contains treasures more valuable than his vessel's entire cargo, his personal library. Scrolls inherited from his grandfather, purchased at great expense in Athens, copied by his own hand during long voyages when Mediterranean winds died and left ships becalmed under endless sky. The complete works of Sophocles, 7 tragedies that made him weep the first time he read them, that taught him more about human nature than 40 years of sailing between ports filled with liars and cheats. A guard lieutenant examines the papyrus with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. His fingers trace Greek letters with surprising delicacy for hands that grip sword hilts professionally. The man can read, Menander realizes with growing horror, which makes this robbery worse than mere theft. These soldiers know exactly what they're stealing. The lieutenant calls to his superior, a scribe wearing the white linen of official Alexandria. The bureaucrat approaches Menander with the practiced sympathy of a tax collector explaining inevitable loss. All ships entering the port must submit their books for copying, the scribe explains with bureaucratic precision. Royal decree, signed by Ptolemy himself. No exceptions for any vessel regardless of cargo or destination. The texts will be returned within days, perfect copies created by the finest scribes in the Mediterranean world. Menander protests that these scrolls represent his family's inheritance, irreplaceable manuscripts copied by scholars who died generations ago. But his words hit administrative indifference like waves against harbour walls. The guards carefully lift his precious library from its protective chest, while scribes record each title with meticulous detail. Sophocles' Antigone, Oedipus Rex, Electra. Tragedies that chronicle human suffering with poetry, that makes gods weep, now becoming entries in the Egyptian capital's vast catalogue of intellectual plunder. The Rhodian captain watches his life's treasures disappear into a government warehouse that stretches along the harbour, like a factory for processing stolen culture. Through open doors, he glimpses an operation that staggers the imagination. Hundreds of scribes bent over writing tables, copying texts with assembly line efficiency, while original manuscripts disappear into storage rooms that seem to extend underground like literary catacombs. Young scribes work in shifts that continue through day and night, their reed pens scratching across fresh papyrus with the rhythm of rainfall on canvas. Older supervisors patrol between tables, ensuring accuracy that rivals the original author's own precision. The copying warehouse operates with military organization and religious dedication, transforming literary theft into an art form practiced on industrial scale. Within 3 days, Menander receives his copies, perfect reproductions written on papyrus inferior to his originals, bound with cheaper materials, produced by scribes whose skill cannot quite match the craftsman who created his family's treasures. The returned scrolls contain Sophocles' exact words, preserve his immortal poetry, but lack the weight of authenticity that made the originals irreplaceable. His grandfather's annotations are gone. The marginal notes that explain difficult passages, the personal reflections written during decades of study, the family history embedded in every page, all erased and replaced with generic perfection. Menander holds copies of masterpieces, while the city's warehouses contain the souls of the books themselves. This scene repeats daily throughout the Great Harbour, as ships from across the Mediterranean discover that the port which promises commercial freedom demands intellectual tribute. Merchants who came to trade goods find themselves contributing to the greatest library in human history, whether they choose to or not. Every vessel becomes an involuntary donor to Ptolemaic ambitions that extend beyond territorial conquest into the realm of accumulated knowledge. The systematic confiscation reaches its most audacious expression in Alexandria's dealings with Athens itself. Demetrius of Phalerum, the library's first organizer, orchestrates an act of literary piracy that makes harbour confiscations seem like petty theft. He approaches Athenian officials with a proposition wrapped in scholarly respectability. Alexandria wishes to borrow the official state copies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides for copying purposes, offering 15 talents of silver as security deposit. 15 talents represents more wealth than most cities see in a generation. The silver deposit alone could fund temple construction, military campaigns, or public works that benefit thousands of citizens. Athenian officials, impressed by the Egyptian port's apparent honesty and overwhelmed by the massive security payment, agree to loan their most precious manuscripts to scholars who promise careful handling and prompt return. The deception unfolds with bureaucratic precision that would make tax collectors proud. The city's scribes do indeed create copies of the borrowed plays, perfect reproductions that preserve every word, every line, every poetic device that made these authors immortal. But when the copying finishes, Athens receives the reproductions, while Alexandria keeps the originals, forfeiting the 15-talent deposit without complaint or explanation. An Athenian ambassador uncovers the trick and reaches the Egyptian capital burning with the fury of gods deceived by mortal hands. He storms into Demetrius's office demanding return of the authentic manuscripts, threatening diplomatic consequences that could affect trade relationships throughout the eastern Mediterranean. His protests echo through palace corridors, with the righteousness of victims discovering they've been swindled by people they trusted. With the patience of a thinker and the hunger of a schemer, the library director absorbs the diplomat's rage as if it were nothing. He explains the city's position with logic that sounds reasonable until examined closely. Athens keeps statues of their great playwrights, marble representations that honor the men, while the Egyptian scholars preserve their souls, the actual words that make them immortal. Which city truly serves the poets better? The ambassador sputters about theft and diplomatic betrayal, but the organizer continues his justification with increasing audacity. These manuscripts will survive longer in the port city's controlled environment than in Athens' humidity and political instability. Future generations will thank Egypt for preserving what Greece might lose through war, natural disaster, or simple neglect. The greatest library in history serves humanity's interests above any single nation's pride. Athens can do nothing except rage impotently while their greatest cultural treasures remain permanently imprisoned in Egyptian warehouses. The 15 talents of forfeited silver represents the price the harbour city pays for owning Greek civilization's dramatic heritage, and Ptolemaic officials consider it money well spent. Through harbour seizures, cunning diplomacy, and generous buying, this relentless pursuit of knowledge remakes the Egyptian port into the Mediterranean world's center of learning. Every confiscated scroll, every borrowed manuscript, every purchased library adds to a collection that grows beyond any previous ruler's imagination. But the hunger for books becomes obsession that recognizes no ethical boundaries. Ships learn to hide their most valuable texts in secret compartments. Scholars travel with decoy libraries while keeping authentic manuscripts elsewhere. And trading companies factor book confiscation into their business expenses like taxes or harbour fees. The great city's harbour searches continue with relentless efficiency, turning every merchant vessel into an unwilling contributor to human knowledge preserved in a single location. The port that promises commercial freedom demands intellectual submission, building the greatest library in history through methods that would make pirates proud. Obsession takes root, and once set in motion, nothing can halt it until every book in the known world rests on the shelves of the Egyptian capital. From its edge, the shadow aims unbroken at eternity. Eratosthenes of Cyrene kneels in Alexandria's great courtyard at the exact moment when the summer sun reaches its zenith, measuring the angle cast by a bronze gnomon that has waited all year for this single instant. Around him, assistants hold wax tablets ready to record calculations that will determine the size of the world itself, while 700 miles south in Sienne, observers confirm what the librarian already knows. At noon, on the solstice, wells reflect sunlight from their depths without any shadow at all. The mathematics unfolds with elegant simplicity that makes gods weep. If Siena sits directly beneath the sun, while Alexandria casts shadows, then the earth curves between these cities at a measurable angle. Eratosthenes traces geometric lines in the sand with a reed pen, his calculations transforming sunlight and shadow into proof that the world is round, vast and knowable through human reason applied with Egyptian precision. 7 degrees and 12 minutes. That fraction of a circle, measured in Alexandria's courtyard, represents the angular distance between two cities, whose separation Eratosthenes knows from royal surveyors who paced the desert roads with military accuracy. Simple multiplication reveals the impossible truth. The Earth measures 252,000 stadia in circumference, a sphere so massive that all human kingdoms combined occupy less space than a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. The head librarian sits back on his heels, stylus trembling in fingers that have just measured creation itself. His calculation differs from the true circumference by less than 2%, an accuracy that will not be matched until men invent instruments powered by electricity and guided by stars that have yet to be discovered. But Eratosthenes focuses on a different revelation entirely. If Earth is this large, how small are human beings? How tiny are their wars, their empires, their passionate certainties about gods who may not even notice their existence? In summer's heat, where the smell of papyrus blends with human striving, a question hovers. Even as another man in the library struggles with infinity of another shape, Callimachus of Cyrene moves through reading rooms that stretch beyond sight, cataloguing the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled under one roof. His task seems impossible, creating an inventory of books that multiply faster than scribes can count them. Under his reed pen, Pinnaces takes shape, a library within the library, constructed entirely of citations, 120 scrolls just to list what the main collection contains, organized by subject and author, with cross-references that map the relationships between human thoughts across centuries of accumulated wisdom. Poetry connects to mathematics through geometric verse. Medicine links to astronomy through theories about celestial influence on bodily health. Philosophy touches every discipline because thinking men question everything they encounter. Callimachus pauses at a shelf containing works that will change the world if anyone bothers to read them carefully. Here rests Aristarchus of Samos, whose calculations prove that the earth revolves around the sun rather than the reverse, a theory so radical that even Alexandria's scholars dismiss it as mathematical curiosity rather than physical truth. The heliocentric universe waits on these shelves for minds brave enough to accept that human eyes deceive, while numbers reveal reality. 3 shelves away sit the engineering treatises of Heron, whose steam engines and mechanical theatres demonstrate that fire and water can be harnessed to perform work without human or animal power. His pneumatic devices operate temples' doors through hidden mechanisms, making statues weep wine and altars burst into flame when priests perform the proper rituals. But Heron's inventions remain curiosities rather than innovations, amusing toys for wealthy patrons rather than tools that could transform civilization. The medical section contains surgical procedures by Herophilus that map the human body with precision, rivaling modern anatomists. His dissections of executed criminals revealed the brain's ventricles, the heart's valves, the nervous system's pathways from spine to fingertips. He performed operations on living patients that will not be attempted again until European doctors rediscover his techniques 15 centuries later, when Christian prohibitions against cutting human flesh finally yield to desperate necessity. All of this knowledge rests in the great library, while the world outside continues its ancient rhythms of war and trade, love and death, ignorance and superstition. Kings commission poets rather than engineers. Generals study tactics rather than geography. Priests preserve ritual rather than investigation. The gap between what humanity knows and what it chooses to use grows wider with each passing year. Eratosthenes returns to his calculations as afternoon shadows lengthen across marble floors where Euclid once walked, where Archimedes corrected geometric proofs, where the greatest minds in human history gathered to push against the boundaries of knowledge itself. His measurement of the earth represents more than mathematical achievement. It proves that the universe operates according to rational principles that human intelligence can discover and understand. But understanding and applying are different arts entirely. The head librarian knows the world's size, but Roman legions will conquer territory through military force rather than geographical calculation. He understands that the sun sits at the center of planetary motion, but sailors will navigate by stars whose movements they interpret through mythology rather than mathematics. The library contains solutions to problems that humanity refuses to admit it has. From every corner of the Mediterranean, young minds arrive, lured by tales of a haven where curiosity holds more weight than certainty, where the act of questioning undermines authority, and where ancient knowledge is raw material for new creation, not immutable truth from silent gods. They walk through reading rooms with the reverence of pilgrims visiting temples, overwhelmed by the scope of human learning preserved between papyrus covers. But for every scholar who arrives seeking wisdom, 10 merchants pass through the port seeking profit. 100 soldiers march past on roads leading to battlefields where iron matters more than insight. The library exists in a world that values it as curiosity rather than necessity, as luxury rather than lifeline, as entertainment for educated elites rather than resource for human survival. The sun sets over Alexandria's harbour, while Eratosthenes completes his calculations, and Callimachus adds another day's entries to his endless catalogue. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, ships carry copies of Greek plays to Roman audiences who will enjoy the stories without understanding the mathematics that made the theatres possible. Caravans transport silk and spices along routes mapped by geographers whose works rest unread in palace libraries. Night falls over the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled, while beyond the library walls, humanity continues making the same mistakes, fighting the same wars, dying from the same diseases that could be cured by wisdom, waiting patiently on dusty shelves for readers who never come. The irony cuts deeper than any blade at the moment when human knowledge reaches its peak, when the size of the Earth has been measured and the movements of planets calculated, when steam engines operate and surgical procedures succeed. The world shows no interest in using what it has learned. All of this will burn, most of it forever. But first, it will face an even crueler fate, being ignored while still intact, dismissed while still accessible, forgotten while still present. The greatest tragedy is not that the knowledge will be destroyed, but that it will be destroyed unused, unread, unappreciated by the very civilization that created it. Sleeping under alien constellations, the library keeps watch, guarding wisdom that waits for humankind to grow worthy. In a cage adorned with gold, Rome's supreme general paces like a rat that cannot escape. Caesar paces the marble floors of Alexandria's royal palace, while Egyptian forces surround the complex with the patience of hunters who know their prey cannot escape. Outside the walls, 20,000 hostile soldiers sharpen swords and string bows, waiting for orders to storm the building, where Rome's most dangerous man has made the mistake of trusting diplomacy over military strength. Inside, the conqueror of Gaul finds himself dependent on a 21-year-old queen whose political survival depends on his continued breathing. Cleopatra reclines on silk cushions that cost more than a Roman soldier's annual pay, watching Caesar's agitation with the calculating calm of a woman who has learned to read men's weaknesses as easily as accountants read ledgers. She understands that the Roman general's reputation for invincibility means nothing if he dies in her palace, that her claim to Egypt's throne crumbles the moment Caesar's blood stains her floors. Their fates have become intertwined like lovers' fingers, but politics rather than passion binds them together. The harbour stretches beyond the palace windows, like a blue promise of escape that grows more distant with each passing hour. Caesar's fleet rocks at anchor in waters controlled by enemies who would rather sink Roman ships than let them carry their cargo of ambition back to Italy. Every vessel represents salvation if he can reach them, death traps if he cannot. The mathematical precision that won battles across Gaul now calculates odds that grow worse with every sunset. Roman legionaries patrol the palace corridors with the nervous energy of professional killers who find themselves protecting rather than attacking, defending rather than conquering. They eye the Egyptian servants with suspicion born of experience. In civil wars, yesterday's allies become today's assassins with the speed of daggers drawn in darkness. Every slave who brings wine might carry poison. Every guard who offers protection might sell it to higher bidders. The general's military mind examines the tactical situation with brutal honesty that has kept him alive through decades of warfare. The palace is defensible, but not indefinitely. The Egyptian forces outnumber his soldiers 5-1, and relief from Rome remains months away, even if Senate bothers to send it. Diplomacy has failed, Bribery has proven insufficient, and negotiation only delays inevitable defeat unless circumstances change dramatically. The Roman fleet represents his only advantage, but advantage turned liability by geography that favors defenders over invaders. His ships cannot approach close enough for evacuation, while hostile forces control the harbor approaches, cannot remain at anchor indefinitely without supplies that must come from a city now turned enemy. Time works against him with the relentlessness of tide, each day weakening his position while strengthening his opponent's resolve. Standing at windows that frame Alexandria's magnificent harbor, Caesar makes a decision that will echo through history with consequences he cannot imagine. If he cannot use his ships for escape, he will use them for destruction so complete that enemies cannot claim victory from his defeat. The fleet that brought him to Egypt will become the instrument of his survival, transformed from transportation into weapon through fire that recognizes no distinction between friend and foe. The orders go out with military efficiency that transforms desperation into strategy. Roman marines prepare incendiary materials with professional thoroughness, while signals coordinate timing that must achieve perfect synchronization or fail catastrophically. Ships' captains receive instructions that violate every instinct of sailors who love their vessels more than wives, who would rather die than deliberately destroy the wooden worlds that have carried them safely across hostile seas. But discipline overcomes sentiment, as it always does in Roman legions. At the general's command, torches touch oil-soaked rigging, while flames leap between masts like divine messengers carrying news of transformation. The Roman fleet becomes a constellation of fire that burns with intensity, visible from Egypt's distant mountains, smoke rising into afternoon sky, like sacrifice to gods who demand blood and gold in equal measure. The fire spreads with hunger that surprises even its creators. Flames jump from burning ships to wooden piers, from piers to warehouses, from warehouses to storage facilities that contain treasures more valuable than the vessels that inadvertently condemned them. Wind carries sparks across harbor waters, like glowing seeds that sprout destruction wherever they land, turning Caesar's desperate gambit into conflagration that threatens half the port district. Dionysus, the dock worker, watches his world end from the warehouse doorway, where he has labored for 20 years, loading and unloading cargo that connects Alexandria to every corner of the Mediterranean world. Behind him stretch storage rooms packed with scrolls awaiting cataloguing, 40,000 manuscripts collected from ships that visited the great port over the past decade, texts that represent the accumulated wisdom of civilizations scattered across 3 continents. The Syrian tries to organize a bucket brigade as flames approach the precious collection, shouting orders to workers who understand the magnitude of what they face. Water from the harbor passed hand to hand through human chains that stretch from docks to doorways, but each bucket seems pitifully small against fires fed by oil-treated wood and driven by winds that grow stronger as heat creates its own weather patterns. Horror transforms into despair as the dock workers realize that water makes oil fires burn hotter rather than cooler, that their rescue efforts actually accelerate the destruction they hope to prevent. Dionysus watches scrolls that chronicle 3,000 years of human achievement, curl and blacken like autumn leaves, their papyrus pages becoming ash that the wind scatters across harbor waters, where fish will feed on the dissolved remains of Babylonian mathematics and Persian poetry. The complete historical works of Berossus burn with the peculiar intensity of papyrus mixed with lamp oil. 3 centuries of Babylonian records, chronicles of kings whose names will now be lost forever, astronomical observations that tracked planetary movements with accuracy, modern science envies, mathematical innovations that anticipated discoveries. European scholars will not make until the Renaissance, transform into smoke that stings the eyes of men, destroying what they cannot replace. Egyptian medical texts suffer the same fate, their surgical procedures and pharmaceutical formulas joining the rising column of literary cremation. Cataract surgery techniques that restore sight to the blind, anatomical drawings that map the human body with precision. Contemporary doctors lack chemical recipes that cure diseases through compounds no living physician remembers how to prepare. All become fuel for fires that care nothing for human suffering their destruction will cause. Early Roman historical accounts disappear into flames that show no respect for patriotic sentiment. Annalists who recorded the Republic's foundation, chroniclers who preserved memories of Etruscan kings and Latin wars, historians whose works will leave gaps in Rome's own past that future scholars struggle desperately to fill. Their scrolls join the funeral pyre of human memory with democratic indifference to political loyalties. Cleopatra watches the harbour burn from palace windows while calculating political mathematics that reduce books to numbers in equations balanced by survival. The queen, who speaks 9 languages, who has read Homer in original Greek and Virgil in manuscript Latin, understands exactly what perishes in the flames consuming her city's greatest treasure. But she also understands that dead knowledge cannot protect living dynasties, that preserving Caesar matters more than preserving scrolls. Books can be recopied, she observes to advisors who suggest negotiating with the Egyptian forces to save the warehouses. Kingdoms cannot be rebuilt once they fall to enemies who show no mercy to defeated royalty. Better to lose a library than lose a throne. Better to sacrifice manuscripts than sacrifice the man whose survival guarantees her own continued reign over the richest nation in the Mediterranean world. The fires burn through the night, while Caesar's desperate strategy succeeds beyond his most optimistic hopes. Egyptian forces abandon their siege to fight blazes that threaten to consume half the city, their attention diverted from military objectives to civilian protection that Roman politicians understand but foreign generals underestimate. In the chaos of emergency response, the palace defenses grow weaker as soldiers become firefighters. Dawn reveals harbour waters choked with ash and debris, the floating remains of both Roman ships and Egyptian warehouses, mingled in grey soup that tastes of salt and sorrow. 40,000 scrolls have become memories, preserved only in the minds of scholars who happen to read them, before circumstances transformed priceless knowledge into worthless smoke. Caesar will escape this trap and live to fight other battles, to cross other rivers, to reshape the Roman world according to his ambitions. History will remember him as conqueror and dictator, general and politician, the man who ended the Republic and began the empire. But Alexandria will remember him as the destroyer who burned more knowledge in a single night than barbarians destroyed in centuries of warfare. 3 years later, guilt or politics will prompt the Roman to send 200,000 scrolls from Pergamon's library to replace what his desperation destroyed. But replacement copies cannot restore unique manuscripts, cannot resurrect lost works, cannot undo the damage inflicted by fire that spread too far and burned too much. The first great burning is complete. The Alexandria that rises from these ashes will never again hold humanity's complete inheritance, never again serve as the single repository where all human knowledge waits for minds wise enough to seek it. One man survives. The world he ruled does not. The heat of the Nile sun glints off gilded palace roofs as Alexandria hums with ambition. Beyond the lighthouse that towers like a marble flame, in royal halls perfumed with myrrh and cedarwood, kings decide not just the fate of armies, but the fate of memory itself. For the Library of Alexandria is no accident of scholarship. It is the weapon and adornment of dynasties, sharpened and polished by rulers who measure their glory in scrolls as much as in soldiers. From the moment Ptolemy I seized Alexander's corpse and crowned himself guardian of Egypt, the library became more than a scholarly dream. It was a political tool. In a world carved up by Alexander's former generals, legitimacy was fragile, thrones precarious, borders in flux. But knowledge could anchor a king's power in ways no army could. While Seleucus ruled from Babylon and Antigonus from Asia Minor, the Egyptian monarch declared that his dominion was not just land, but wisdom itself, drawn from every corner of the known world. His son, Ptolemy II, carried this vision further, transforming Alexandria into a city whose name meant learning as much as wealth. The royal court patronized poets and philosophers with the same extravagance it spent on chariots and palaces. Scholars received stipends from the treasury, food from royal kitchens, and even tax exemptions. Privileges once reserved for priests now granted to men of letters. The Mausion, the temple of the muses, functioned as both sanctuary and laboratory, where thinkers debated under painted colonnades and dissected animals in lecture halls that echoed with the clash of reason against tradition. This generosity was not pure idealism. Kings understood that the prestige of harboring the greatest minds of the age enhanced their rule more effectively than another line of spearmen. To host Eratosthenes, who measured the earth itself, was to claim mastery over the very globe Rome still struggled to dominate. To employ Callimachus, who catalogued hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was to suggest that the Egyptian monarch, unlike his rivals, commanded not only armies, but also the vast inheritance of human culture. The library was a mirror in which rulers saw themselves reflected as demigods, their grandeur magnified by the wisdom they possessed. Rivalry sharpened this obsession. Across the Aegean, the kings of Pergamon began building their own collection, a rival library meant to challenge Alexandria's supremacy. The competition became so fierce that it bled into economics. When Egyptian authorities restricted exports of papyrus to starve Pergamon's supply, their opponents perfected the use of parchment, a material that would eventually outlast papyrus in European bookmaking. What began as dynastic competition accidentally changed the technology of writing itself, proof that the ambitions of kings could shape the medium of memory for centuries. Still, Alexandria's scale remained unmatched. Travelers from Rhodes, Athens, and Antioch reported that no subject escaped the voracious appetite of the Egyptian collectors. Royal agents scoured markets for lost tragedies, obscure treatises, and foreign scripts. Greek texts stood beside Egyptian rituals, transcribed in Greek letters, Indian mathematics translated by bilingual merchants, Babylonian star charts copied by patient scribes who may not have understood their meaning, but preserved them nonetheless. The kings demanded not just the heritage of Greece, but the wisdom of every people under heaven. In this atmosphere, scholars became both servants and symbols. They debated Homer's verses, while serving the prestige of rulers who paid their salaries. They discovered mathematical laws, while lending legitimacy to monarchs whose crowns depended on fragile politics. Some accepted the bargain gladly. Others grumbled that philosophy chained to power lost its freedom. But all understood that without kings, the library would have remained a dream, scattered across 1,000 fragile manuscripts instead of gathered into one monumental collection. The symbiosis between throne and scroll also had darker undertones. Knowledge, once preserved, could be hidden as easily as revealed. There were whispers that certain texts, Egyptian priestly manuals, Hermetic treatises, foreign prophecies, remained locked away, shown only to monarchs and their closest counselors. If knowledge was power, then absolute power demanded control of knowledge itself. The same kings who displayed their scholars like jewels also concealed some works like weapons, never to be read outside palace walls. Dynastic turbulence threatened this delicate balance. Not all Ptolemies possessed the vision of their founder. Some lavished coin on festivals and feasts while allowing scholars' stipends to dwindle. Others treated the library as a private treasury, plundering it for political advantage. Court intrigues turned librarians into pawns, and rival claimants to the throne sometimes saw the institution less as a monument of learning than as an asset to be bartered in power struggles. Each succession crisis cast a shadow over the shelves, reminding scribes that knowledge could never float above politics. It was chained to it, for better or worse. Yet even during turbulent reigns, the city's reputation kept scholars coming. A physician from Kos, an astronomer from Babylon, a philosopher from Cyrene, all found refuge in halls painted with mosaics of the 9 muses. They came not only for the patronage, but for the company, for the chance to debate equals in a city where wisdom was currency as much as gold. To walk through Alexandria's colonnades was to walk through a symposium spanning continents and centuries, the collected memory of humanity, distilled into voices echoing off marble walls. Beyond the palace, ordinary citizens glimpsed this glory at festivals where royal processions displayed manuscripts alongside treasures of silver and ivory. Scrolls were paraded like trophies of war, proof that Egypt conquered the world not only with swords, but with ideas. To Alexandrians in the marketplace, the library was both myth and reality, a towering presence just beyond reach, guarded by kings but whispered about in taverns as if it contained the very secrets of the cosmos. Pride swelled among the people, even if they never set foot inside its sanctuaries. Still, fragility lingered beneath the marble. A library tied to kings lived and died with them. If rulers lost interest, if wars drained the treasury, if faith demanded different loyalties, the institution's foundation could crumble faster than papyrus in damp air. Scholars sensed this, though few dared to speak aloud. They copied as fast as they could, annotated with urgency, as if racing against an invisible clock. For even in its height, Alexandria's treasure carried the seed of its downfall, dependence on the whims of power. The rivalry with Pergamon symbolized both ambition and vulnerability. While Alexandrian agents stole, purchased, and confiscated texts to maintain supremacy, Pergamon's parchment innovation ensured survival beyond Alexandria's fortunes. A cruel irony. The very rivalry that demonstrated Egypt's supremacy also prepared the medium that would outlive the city's flames. Kings sought immortality through papyrus. Rivals gave posterity parchment. As one dynasty succeeded another, the library endured, adapting to the character of each monarch. Under strong rulers, it flourished like a river in flood. Under weak ones, it shrank like a stream in drought. Yet even in decline, it remained the envy of the world. No matter the politics, no rival could boast a collection so vast, so ambitious, so audacious. The dreams survived not because kings loved wisdom, but because they loved glory, and to host the world's greatest library was to wear a crown brighter than gold. Thus, the Library of Alexandria stood, half monument, half pawn, both jewel and hostage of dynasties. It embodied the ambitions of kings as much as the brilliance of scholars, a fragile symbiosis of knowledge and power. While armies marched and thrones wavered, scrolls accumulated, filling halls that whispered both promise and peril. And yet, behind every triumph, lingered an unspoken truth. What kings give, kings can also take away. The same hand that funds a philosopher can silence him. The same treasury that buys books can burn them. The library's grandeur depended not only on human curiosity, but on royal will. And royal will is a fickle guardian. The pharaohs who preserved the dream also sowed its fragility, for in making knowledge a prize of dynasties, they ensured that when dynasties fell, knowledge would fall with them. The shadow of the double-headed eagle stretches across the Nile, where once Ptolemaic kings ruled with jeweled crowns and divine titles. Now Roman governors sit in marble halls, speaking Latin to Egyptian scribes who still think in Greek. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, has changed masters. Yet its library, vast, unmatched, still shimmering with the aura of collected knowledge, remains a prize worth keeping, though its fate now lies in the hands of emperors who view learning not as sacred duty, but as ornament to power. When Octavian, soon to be Augustus, entered Alexandria in 30 BC, after Cleopatra's death, he gazed upon the lighthouse, the palaces, the harbour warehouses stacked with goods from India and Nubia, and he saw wealth, not wisdom. The library had already suffered during Caesar's civil war, losing thousands of manuscripts in the fires of 48 BC, but enough remained to preserve its prestige. To the first Roman emperor, however, this was not a temple of the muses, but a trophy of conquest, as much a spoil as Cleopatra's golden barge or Antony's defeated legions. Roman administrators preserved the library in name, but not always in spirit. Funding became uneven, dependent on imperial whim. Some emperors granted stipends to scholars, encouraging mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Others treated the institution with benign neglect, allowing its catalogues to yellow and its scribes to scatter. Rome's genius was not preservation, but power, and libraries, however grand, rarely ranked high on lists of imperial necessities. Grain shipments from Egypt mattered more than scrolls. Still, scholars continued their work, sheltered by the aura that clung to Alexandria like perfume from an aging queen. Mathematicians refined geometric proofs. Physicians practiced surgeries with instruments that would not reappear in Europe until the Renaissance. Astronomers tracked planets with calculations still admired for their precision. Philosophers debated Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Neoplatonism in lecture halls that echoed with the footsteps of students from Spain, Syria, and even Gaul. Rome's conquest had dimmed but not extinguished the city's light. Yet under Rome, new tensions crackled through Alexandria's streets. The city was no longer merely Greek and Egyptian. It became Roman as well, a crucible where cultures clashed as often as they blended. The Jewish community, long established, flourished in trade and scholarship, but found itself caught between pagan traditions and Roman authority. Greek elites clung to their cultural prestige, resenting both Roman governors and local Egyptians who demanded greater recognition. Into this volatile mix came the first Christian preachers, carrying words that would eventually ignite fires more destructive than Caesar's torches. The library itself became both stage and symbol in these cultural struggles. To Roman rulers, it represented continuity, proof that their empire preserved Greek civilization, even as it conquered Greek lands. To Alexandrian scholars, it was a fragile refuge where inquiry still mattered in a world increasingly dominated by politics and spectacle. To religious zealots, Jewish, Christian, and pagan alike, it sometimes appeared as a fortress of dangerous knowledge, a repository of ideas that could undermine faith. Thus, the library survived, but precariously, perched on the shifting fault lines of an empire that valued stability above all else. One emperor, Claudius, displayed unusual devotion to learning. Himself a scholar, mocked for his stammer, he expanded libraries in Rome and encouraged the preservation of texts. Under his reign, the Alexandrian library may have enjoyed a brief revival, its scholars emboldened by an emperor who preferred scrolls to swords. But such moments were rare. More often, emperors viewed Alexandria with suspicion, remembering that it was Cleopatra's capital, Antony's refuge, a city that had defied Rome until crushed by legions. To grant too much freedom, intellectual or political, risked rebellion. Better to keep scholars on stipends than allow them to grow into voices of opposition. Meanwhile, the city's role as breadbasket of the empire overshadowed its intellectual heritage. Ships carrying grain from Egypt fed Rome's hungry masses. A missed harvest could trigger riots in the capital. To Roman officials, Alexandria's warehouses mattered more than its scroll-filled halls. Governors arrived with soldiers, not scribes. The library's fate became secondary to the empire's stomach. Yet knowledge does not disappear simply because rulers neglect it. In the halls of the Mausion, teachers still gathered students and ideas still blossomed. Medical texts continued to be copied. Commentaries on Aristotle and Plato multiplied, sometimes obscuring original brilliance under layers of interpretation, but ensuring survival nonetheless. Even as the empire hardened into bureaucracy, Alexandria's scholars whispered questions about the cosmos, the soul, and the fabric of reality itself. The library endured, though more as ember than flame. But the tensions in Alexandria grew sharper. Jewish uprisings erupted, met with brutal Roman suppression that scarred the city's memory. Pagan processions clashed with Christian gatherings in streets that once echoed with philosophical debate. Each conflict left scars on the cultural life of Alexandria. Each scar weakened the library, if not directly by flame, then by eroding the stability scholars needed to thrive. Rome could crush rebellion, but it could not cultivate curiosity in soil watered with blood. By the 2nd century AD, the Serapeum had risen as both temple and secondary library, a shadow twin of the Great Collection. Some sources suggest that by then, much of the original Mausion's holdings had been dispersed, damaged, or neglected, while the Serapeum carried on as custodian of the city's remaining treasures. Roman administrators allowed this, for temples still carried prestige, and Serapis, the hybrid god of Greek and Egyptian devotion, served as a convenient emblem of Rome's cultural tolerance. But even this tolerance had limits. The empire's patience for diversity would shrink as Christianity spread, and emperors demanded unity of belief as well as loyalty of taxes. For now, though, Alexandria continued as a city of contradictions. Gladiators fought in its arenas, while philosophers lectured in its halls. Roman governors levied taxes, while Greek scribes copied Homer. Egyptian priests tended to ancient rituals, while Jewish scholars studied Torah beside Greek philosophers parsing Aristotle. And all the while, the library stood as silent witness, its shelves groaning with wisdom gathered from empires past, even as the current empire cared more for power than for truth. The irony deepened with each generation. Rome inherited the dream of Alexandria, but did not nurture it. The scrolls remained, but the vision that had driven the Ptolemies, the audacious belief that all human knowledge could be gathered, preserved, and studied, faded under the weight of imperial pragmatism. The library survived, but as relic rather than beacon, as adornment rather than mission. It was no longer humanity's greatest ambition. It was a possession, a prize displayed in a conquered city whose glory lay in its past. And yet, fragility is not the same as death. Even under Rome, the library whispered. Students traced diagrams on wax tablets. Physicians consulted ancient case notes. Astronomers recorded planetary positions. Philosophers debated the nature of the soul. The empire might neglect, governors might forget, emperors might scorn, but as long as a single scholar walked the halls, the dream still breathed. Alexandria's flame flickered, not yet extinguished, but storms gathered. Rome itself would change, its gods challenged by a new faith that grew stronger in Alexandria than almost anywhere else. The city that once embodied harmony between East and West would become a battlefield of belief. And when faith clashed with curiosity, when certainty demanded the silence of questions, the library would face its greatest trial. Smoke curls upward from the harbour. Not yet the black column of absolute destruction, but the first warning that Alexandria's dream is mortal. The year is 48 BC. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, victor of a dozen campaigns, master of legions hardened by 10 years of blood and mud, has come to Egypt not as liberator or scholar, but as fugitive. His civil war with Pompey has spilled into the Nile Delta, and the Library of Alexandria, unwitting, unarmed, stands in the path of history's most dangerous man at his most desperate hour. The war begins with betrayal. Pompey the Great, once Caesar's ally, flees to Egypt after Pharsalus, hoping for refuge with the boy king Ptolemy XIII. Instead, he finds a dagger. Murdered on the shore before his wife's eyes, his severed head presented to Caesar as a gift, Pompey becomes a cautionary tale of loyalty squandered. Caesar recoils from the display, not from pity, but from calculation. He sees in the act not allegiance, but arrogance, a sign that Egypt's rulers think they can manipulate Rome's destiny. That arrogance must be punished, and Caesar's presence in Alexandria becomes more than a stopover. It becomes a siege. The Roman general installs himself in the royal palace beside Cleopatra, the queen who wagers her throne on his survival. Outside the palace walls, Ptolemy's forces swarm, outnumbering Caesar's men 5-1. Inside, tension coils like a drawn bowstring. The library, sprawling along the harbour with its warehouses of confiscated scrolls, lies just beyond the palace district, its treasures vulnerable to any spark in a city already on the edge of riot. Caesar calculates with the cold logic that made him master of Gaul. His fleet, anchored in the harbour, is both salvation and liability. If captured, it gives his enemies mobility and supplies. If destroyed, it denies them the sea. In desperation, he chooses fire. Roman marines set torches to ships moored along the piers. Flames leap from mast to mast, a barrier of fire meant to shield the palace from Egyptian assault. The decision is tactical, but fire is no obedient servant. What begins as strategy becomes catastrophe. Wind carries sparks into the warehouses that line the docks. Warehouses filled not with grain or oil, but with scrolls. For decades, every ship entering Alexandria had been forced to surrender its books for copying. Originals, once duplicated, were stored here until catalogued and added to the library's shelves. Tens of thousands of manuscripts, the work of generations, sit stacked in crates, awaiting the patient labor of scribes. In a single night, that patience is betrayed by flame. Dionysius, a dock worker, watches helplessly as the fire races across the timbered roofs. He had spent years hauling crates of manuscripts, muttering about their weight, cursing the endless bureaucracy that measured cargo, not in talents of silver, but in lines of Greek. Now he realizes what he carried. Plays of Sophocles never performed. Treatises on medicine written in Babylonian cuneiform. Histories of kingdoms already erased from memory. He shouts for water, organizes men into bucket lines, but each splash hisses uselessly against oil-fed flames. The scrolls blacken, curl, collapse into ash that dances upward on the heat. fragments of knowledge scattering into night sky like lost prayers. Scholars in the palace can only watch. The philosopher Sosigenes, later to advise Caesar on calendar reform, sees astronomical records consumed in an hour that had taken centuries to assemble. Physicians trained on Egyptian texts recognize the smoke rising from papyrus as the cremation of cures yet undiscovered. Some weep, others rage, but none can stop the fire. Knowledge dies not with a scream, but with a crackle, drowned by the roar of soldiers shouting triumph as they defend the palace from assault. Ancient writers disagree about the scale of destruction. Some say the entire library perished in that night. Others claim only the harbor warehouses burned, tens of thousands of scrolls, but not the whole. Later generations will argue endlessly, some minimizing, others magnifying the loss. But for those who stood on the docks, watching texts curl into smoke, there was no debate. The first great wound to humanity's memory had been struck, and the scar would never fade. Caesar, meanwhile, survives. The fire distracts Ptolemy's forces long enough for his legions to hold the palace. Cleopatra secures her throne beside him. Rome secures Egypt's grain, and Caesar secures his legend. Yet his victory carries an unintended cost. The general who sought to master time with his calendar reforms, who dreamed of reshaping Rome into empire, also became, however unwillingly, the first destroyer of the world's greatest library. He will send scrolls from Pergamon years later as replacement, but parchment copies cannot resurrect papyrus originals, cannot restore marginal notes in forgotten hands, cannot conjure lost voices from ash. In the aftermath, Alexandria struggles to recover. Scribes redouble their efforts. Scholars cling to what survives. New acquisitions arrive by ship and caravan. The library lives on, though diminished, like a wounded giant limping forward. But the illusion of invincibility is gone. What once seemed eternal is revealed as fragile. Fire has shown that knowledge, however vast, can be undone in a single night by chance, by wind, by war. The people whisper. Some blame Caesar, others Cleopatra, others still the gods who punish arrogance. Priests of Serapis murmur that sacred wisdom is not meant for all eyes, that the flames are divine judgment. Philosophers argue in porticos about fate and fortune, and across the empire rumors spread that Alexandria, the city of books, has lost its soul. Still, the library refuses to die quietly. For centuries more, its scribes will copy, its scholars will teach, its shelves will grow. The first flames mark not the end, but the beginning of decline, the first act in a tragedy that will span centuries. Caesar saved his crown, but scarred humanity. The smoke that rose from Alexandria's harbor was more than ash. It was a prophecy, a reminder that no empire, no library, no dream is immune to fire. From the palace balcony, Cleopatra watched the blaze with eyes that calculated survival. For her, the loss of scrolls mattered less than the survival of Caesar, the man who secured her throne. For Caesar, the destruction was an accident, a footnote in a military campaign. For the scholars who saw their life's work vanish in smoke, it was the end of the world. History would preserve Caesar and Cleopatra as lovers, conquerors, rulers. It would preserve the library only as victim. But though wounded, it endured. The Serapeum would rise as secondary sanctuary. Scholars would continue to measure the heavens, map the earth, and dissect the human body. Alexandria would remain a beacon, though its light flickered. The library had faced its first fire, but not its last. Greater storms loomed, storms not of strategy, but of faith, of zeal, of empires less tolerant than Rome. And when those storms broke, the flames would not be accidental. Morning light spills across Alexandria's marble colonnades, glinting off columns weathered by centuries of sea air. The harbour bustles with the cries of merchants, the clatter of carts, and the scent of spices brought from Arabia and India. To a visitor arriving by ship, the city still looks like the beating heart of the Hellenistic world. The lighthouse towers, the palaces gleam, and the library's shadow stretches across the cultural quarter. Yet beneath this brilliance, cracks have begun to spread. What survived Caesar's flames now walks a thin line between endurance and decay. After the disaster of 48 BC, efforts were made to restore the library's holdings. Replacement scrolls arrived from Pergamon, sent at Caesar's behest as a token of amends, or perhaps as political theatre. Other manuscripts came through trade, tribute, and the steady confiscation of books from ships docking in the harbour. The copying workshops worked without pause, filling shelves once emptied by fire. But the wound had been deep. Originals with notes in ancient hands could not be conjured back, and scholars muttered that the soul of the collection had been lost even if the body still lived. For the next 2 centuries, the library existed in a paradoxical state. It endured, but the confidence of invincibility was gone. Once it had seemed a fortress against time. Now it appeared vulnerable, still vast, still unique, but haunted by the knowledge that disaster could strike again. This awareness gnawed at scholars who had once believed their work eternal. They hurried their copies, annotated in haste, fearing tomorrow might rob them of their manuscripts. Fragility had crept into a place that once embodied permanence. The Serapeum rose during these years as the institution's second home, a temple library that stood on the city's western ridge, flanked by statues of gods and guarded by priests of Serapis. To many, it was more than a sanctuary for worship. It was a vault for wisdom. Scribes transferred works there, diversifying the city's holdings, as if scattering seeds against a storm. The Serapeum never equaled the original Mausion in size, but it gave Alexandrian scholarship another pillar, a safeguard against the memory of fire. Meanwhile, the scholars themselves pressed on. In lecture halls, mathematicians refined theories first laid out by Euclid. Physicians continued to draw from the notes of Herophilus and other pioneers. Philosophers debated the soul and the cosmos, weaving strands of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics into new syntheses. Their work spread quietly across the empire, copied into private collections in Antioch, Athens, and Rome. Alexandria's brilliance dimmed, but never went dark. The library had shifted from symbol of invincibility to embattled survivor. Still, decline crept closer with each passing generation. The Ptolemaic dynasty was gone. Rome ruled now, and Roman priorities were different. For the emperors, Egypt mattered as granary first, cultural jewels second. Grain shipments fed Rome's masses. Scrolls did not. Funding waxed and waned depending on the whims of governors and emperors. Scholars were supported, but the grandeur of Ptolemaic patronage faded. What had once been central to royal identity was now one more adornment in an empire vast beyond imagining. Worse still, Alexandria itself became a city of conflict. Jewish uprisings scarred its streets, forcing Roman garrisons to crush rebellion with brutal efficiency. Pagan processions clashed with new Christian assemblies, each group claiming ownership of truth. The library stood between them all, less participant than backdrop, yet vulnerable to every tremor that shook the city. Books require peace to flourish. Conflict breeds neglect. Each riot, each rebellion, each street battle pulled attention away from scrolls and towards survival. Inside the library's halls, the rhythm of copying continued. Scribes bent over papyrus, preserving text after text with patient precision. Yet fewer new works arrived. The great age of acquisition had passed. Where once agents scoured the world for manuscripts, now the influx slowed. Knowledge still accumulated, but not with the hunger of earlier centuries. The ambition to gather everything had been replaced by the more modest goal of keeping what remained. Preservation overshadowed expansion. Even so, brilliance endured. Physicians continued performing operations recorded nowhere else. Astronomers still charted stars with methods more exact than their contemporaries in Rome or Carthage. Commentators on Aristotle produced works that would travel to Syria and centuries later to Baghdad, helping spark fresh revolutions of thought. The irony was cruel. Even as the library declined at home, its influence spread abroad, echoing through regions that would one day inherit its mantle. Ordinary Alexandrians viewed the library with mingled pride and distance. For most, it was a monument, not a workplace. They saw its white walls, heard rumors of treasures locked within, but rarely entered its sanctuaries. Still, it remained part of civic identity, the boast that set their city apart. Traders in the marketplace told travelers of halls filled with more scrolls than any mind could count. Priests gestured toward the Serapeum as proof that Alexandria was chosen by the gods of wisdom. Even diminished, the library was legend, but the ground beneath it continued to shift. As Christianity gained footholds in the city, its preachers condemned pagan texts as snares for the soul. Pagan philosophers countered that divine truth required inquiry. Jewish thinkers carved their own path, blending tradition with Greek philosophy in a synthesis unique to Alexandria. Each group claimed wisdom, each distrusted the others. The library, impartial and immense, held works from all traditions. To some, that inclusivity was its strength. To others, it was its danger. The emperors in distant Rome rarely noticed. To them, Alexandria was one city among hundreds. A jewel, yes, but not irreplaceable. When they did involve themselves, it was often to enforce order, not to preserve scrolls. Governors focused on quelling riots, maintaining grain flows, and collecting taxes. The guardians of the library learned that they could expect little direct help. Their work depended on their own persistence, not imperial decree. This period left behind few dramatic stories. No statues crashing to the ground, no torches raised in zeal. Instead, its tragedy was slow erosion. Fewer manuscripts acquired, fewer scholars funded, fewer students flocking to its lecture halls. The grand dream had shifted from conquest of knowledge to survival of fragments. It was not destruction by fire, but by neglect. And yet, even in decline, it mattered. Centuries later, when Arab scholars in Baghdad translated Greek works, many of their sources traced back to Alexandrian copies. When medieval physicians stumbled upon advanced surgical methods, echoes of Herophilus could still be heard. The library may have shrunk, but its legacy seeped outward like water through sand, nourishing lands far beyond Egypt's shores. By the 3rd century AD, the institution had become a shadow of its former self, but a stubborn shadow. It persisted where many had expected it to vanish. The Serapeum still sheltered manuscripts. Teachers still lectured in colonnades. Students still argued beneath painted ceilings. Alexandria's intellectual light, though dimmer, flickered on. But storm clouds gathered on the horizon. A new religion was rising fast, and with it came demands not for preservation, but for purity. The first flames had been accidental, born of Caesar's strategy. The next would be deliberate, fueled by faith that saw scrolls as threats. Between survival and decline, the library endured. But endurance alone could not last forever. On a hill west of Alexandria's crowded streets, where the city's noise fades into desert winds, the Serapeum rises like a sentinel of stone. Dedicated to Serapis, the fusion of Greek and Egyptian divinity, it stands both as temple and as vault, a place where incense burns before statues, while knowledge slumbers in shadowed halls. After Caesar's flames scarred the great library, the Serapeum became its second heart, pumping fragments of wisdom into a body already weakened. Here, in marble chambers beneath the gaze of gods, humanity's memory lingered, even as time and neglect wore away at its edges. The Serapeum was never as vast as the original Mausion, but it carried symbolic weight. Built with royal patronage, adorned with colossal columns and towering statues, it proclaimed that Alexandria had not surrendered to fire. Within its sanctuaries, priests copied texts onto fresh papyrus, scribes catalogued works that had survived, and philosophers lectured in colonnades where religion and scholarship intertwined. For generations, when visitors asked if the library still lived, Alexandrians pointed to the Serapeum as proof that the dream endured. Still, this sanctuary was more than a warehouse. Its priests believed that Serapis himself protected the wisdom stored inside. Marble corridors echoed with chants as much as with scholarly debate. Offerings of wine and honey accompanied rituals to the god who embodied both Greek reason and Egyptian eternity. To many Alexandrians, the Serapeum was not merely a storehouse of books. It was a sacred fortress, where divine guardianship ensured that wisdom would never die. For centuries, the temple thrived as a twin institution, part shrine, part archive. Scholars who feared the main library's decline found refuge here, guarded by walls thick enough to withstand riots and fires that too often consumed Alexandria's quarters. When the streets filled with shouts of sectarian violence, the Serapeum's gates offered a kind of sanctuary, not only for believers, but for texts. In darkened vaults, manuscripts from Greece, Babylon, India, and Egypt rested like exiles, preserved by the very secrecy that excluded ordinary citizens from glimpsing them. But secrecy has two faces. The very walls that protected also isolated. Some texts circulated freely among scholars, copied and discussed in lecture halls. Others vanished into guarded rooms, spoken of in whispers, their contents restricted to high priests or trusted scribes. Rumors spread of hermetic treatises locked away, of Egyptian rituals translated into Greek and hidden from public view, of books describing metals that transmute and medicines that cure ailments no physician dares name. Whether these tales were truth or legend, they gave the Serapeum an aura of mystery that fascinated outsiders and provoked suspicion among zealots. Life in the city beyond those walls grew increasingly turbulent. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, Alexandria's population was a mosaic of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and increasingly Christians. Each group claimed authority over truth, and each eyed the others with mistrust. Pagan festivals filled streets with music and incense. Christian gatherings proclaimed one God and condemned idols. Jewish scholars debated Torah in Greek translation, while philosophers passed Aristotle in lecture halls near the harbour. In this fractured city, the Serapeum stood as symbol of the old ways, a monument to traditions that blended reason with ritual, inquiry with faith. Tensions occasionally exploded into violence. Riots scarred neighborhoods, leaving broken statues and burned homes. Though the Serapeum itself remained untouched, its presence loomed over every conflict. To pagans, it was their holiest sanctuary, proof that the gods of their ancestors still reigned. To Christians, it was an idol's house, a shrine to falsehood. To Roman governors, it was both a potential threat and a useful reminder of imperial tolerance. So long as it stood, it embodied both Alexandria's glory and its divisions. Inside, the work of preservation continued quietly. Scribes bent over desks in lamplight, copying treatises on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Priests debated whether certain works should remain hidden or be shared. Young students whispered their first questions beneath painted ceilings, their voices trembling with the weight of history around them. Outside, merchants haggled in markets and soldiers drilled in barracks, unaware that a few streets away, ideas that might reshape humanity slumbered in silence. By the 3rd century, however, fragility deepened. Rome itself faltered under pressures of invasion, civil war, and economic strain. Funding that once supported scholars shrank. Governors focused on order, not on wisdom. The Serapeum relied increasingly on its priests for upkeep, its identity tilting more toward temple than library. Scrolls were still copied, but fewer arrived from abroad. The hunger to acquire everything, the ambition that had once defined Alexandria, had dwindled into the quieter hope of protecting what survived. Even so, the Serapeum retained its aura. Pilgrims climbed its steps not only to honor Serapis, but to glimpse what remained of the city's intellectual treasure. Travelers carried rumors from its halls to distant lands, that ancient cures were hidden there, that star maps older than Rome's empire rested in dusty chests, that secrets of lost civilizations lay waiting for discovery. The truth was smaller, but no less vital. Even fragments of knowledge mattered. Even echoes could inspire. Even so, the city's changing spirit foreshadowed the temple's fate. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, gained followers with each passing decade. By the late 3rd century, Christian bishops rivaled pagan priests in influence. Their sermons thundered against idols, warning that demons hid behind marble statues. The Serapeum, with its towering image of Serapis and its fusion of scholarship with ritual, became a natural target. For now, imperial tolerance preserved it. But tolerance is a fragile shield when conviction hardens into zeal. Within the Serapeum, guardians of knowledge sensed the danger. They copied more urgently, smuggling duplicates into private collections, hiding manuscripts in monasteries and private homes. A subtle diaspora of books began, scattered by the fear that the temple's walls might one day fall. Yet even this precaution could not match the scale of what the Serapeum held. Thousands of texts still waited on shelves, dependent on priests whose prayers might not withstand the storm gathering beyond their gates. The irony is sharp. What began as a safeguard after Caesar's flames had become itself vulnerable to new fire. The Serapeum carried Alexandria's memory, but memory alone cannot shield against ideology. In the streets, crowds shouted hymns, denouncing idols with the same fervor that once cheered Caesar. The stage was set, the actors already gathering. It was no longer a question of if the Serapeum would fall, but when. For now, though, the shadow library endured. Within its walls, the wisdom of centuries lingered in fragile ink and papyrus, waiting for hands strong enough to preserve it, or flames fierce enough to erase it. On the hill, above Alexandria, the Serapeum watched over a city tearing itself apart, a guardian too sacred for some, too dangerous for others, and too fragile to last forever. The wind off the harbor carries hymns instead of hymns to Isis, voices lifted not to Serapis but to Christ. By the 4th century AD, Alexandria, once the greatest city of the Hellenistic world, has become one of Christianity's strongest bastions. Temples still stand, statues still gleam under desert sun. The Serapeum still crowns its hill. Yet in the streets below, crosses outnumber idols. and the rhythm of the city's life beats to new prayers. Christianity had arrived in Alexandria early, carried by sailors, merchants, and exiles from Judea. In a city already accustomed to blending gods, philosophies, and traditions, the new faith found fertile ground. Some Jews embraced it, seeing in Christ the fulfillment of ancient law. Some Greeks found in it a purity lacking in the philosophical schools. Egyptians, weary of rulers who spoke foreign tongues, found hope in a God who preached to slaves and peasants as much as to kings. By the 2nd century, Alexandria was not only a city of philosophers, but also of bishops, not only of scholars, but of martyrs. Its Christian teachers were formidable. Clement of Alexandria, born in Athens but settled by the Nile, sought to reconcile Greek philosophy with the gospel. To him, truth was not divided. Plato's wisdom could serve Christ as well as Aristotle's logic. He lectured in halls where once students had passed Homer, urging them to see the Logos, divine reason, as the thread linking Hellenic thought to Christian revelation. His work spread far, showing that Alexandria was more than birthplace of heresies. It was also a forge of synthesis. After Clement came Origen, whose genius astonished even his opponents. Barely 17 when he began teaching, he combined encyclopedic learning with a fierce devotion to scripture. He studied Hebrew texts alongside Greek translations, produced commentaries that filled volumes, and speculated boldly on creation, salvation, and the soul. To some, he was a saint of intellect. To others, a dangerous innovator. His writings shaped Christianity across centuries, influencing East and West alike. But even his brilliance bore the marks of Alexandria's library, the hunger to preserve, to harmonize, to explain. Origen embodied the city's restless fusion of faith and inquiry. Yet harmony was fragile. Alexandria was never a quiet city, and in religion, as in politics, its passions burned hotter than most. Pagan devotees saw in Christianity an enemy of their gods. Jewish communities, long established, felt threatened by a faith that claimed to supersede their law, and Christians themselves fractured into sects, each proclaiming its interpretation of Scripture as truth. Arians argued against the divinity of Christ. Athanasians defended it. Gnostics spun cosmologies that blurred myth with theology. The streets rang with debates as fierce as any sword clash, and sometimes debates ended in blood. The library and Serapeum stood in the midst of this turmoil, like fortresses of memory, reminders of a world where inquiry had been shielded by kings rather than torn by sects. To Christian leaders, these institutions were ambiguous. On one hand, they preserved texts of philosophy and science that could be turned toward the faith. On the other, they sheltered pagan lies, the works of philosophers who denied revelation, priests who worshipped idols, astrologers who read stars instead of scripture. Some bishops tolerated the libraries as useful, others denounced them as demonic. As Christianity grew, its relationship with classical learning shifted. Early teachers like Clement and Origen embraced philosophy as ally. Later leaders grew more suspicious. Why study Euclid when scripture was sufficient? Why preserve Aristotle when prophets had spoken? The very methods of the library, collection, comparison, questioning, seemed to some like snares of the devil, temptations to wander from revelation into doubt. Faith demanded certainty. Scholarship thrived on questions. Their coexistence grew uneasy. Meanwhile, the city's crowds lent their weight to the contest. In Alexandria, religion was not confined to temples or churches. It spilled into markets, docks, and squares. Mobs gathered behind priests and bishops as readily as behind generals. When passions flared, riots erupted. Statues were toppled, shrines desecrated, synagogues burned. Authority shifted from governor to bishop, from emperor's representative to Christ's shepherd. The balance of power tilted, and the keepers of old gods began to feel cornered. The Serapeum became focal point of this tension. To pagans, it was last stronghold of their gods, their library, their heritage. To Christians, it was rival altar, symbol of superstition that must yield to the cross. As congregations swelled, as bishops thundered sermons against idols, pressure mounted. The sanctuary that had once been refuge for books and rituals now stood as fortress of resistance, and therefore as target. Imperial politics accelerated the change. Constantine the Great's conversion in the early 4th century gave Christianity legal standing across the empire. Temples were not yet outlawed, but the wind shifted. Funding flowed to churches, bishops gained influence, and Christian congregations multiplied. Alexandria, already a center of Christian teaching, surged with new confidence. Pagan priests sensed the ground slipping beneath them. Their processions grew more defiant, their defenses more desperate. By the time Theodosius I issued decrees against pagan worship in the late 4th century, the stage was set. Christianity was no longer one sect among many. It was the empire's official faith. Temples closed, sacrifices banned, idols condemned. In Alexandria, these edicts fell like thunder. For centuries, the city had thrived on diversity, its identity woven from Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Roman threads. Now, uniformity was demanded, and tolerance narrowed to a blade's edge. For the library and Serapeum, this shift was perilous. They embodied a world of plurality. Philosophers beside priests, astrologers beside physicians, Homer beside Moses. To a faith that sought purity, such coexistence looked like corruption. Christian mobs, emboldened by bishops and imperial law, began to target pagan sanctuaries. Smaller temples fell first, their statues shattered, their altars repurposed. Each fall brought the Serapeum closer to the edge. And yet, for a time, the books endured. Even as zealots stormed shrines, scribes still copied manuscripts by lamplight. Even as bishops thundered against idolatry, physicians consulted ancient texts to treat illness. Even as mobs shouted for idols to fall, philosophers debated in quiet corners of the city. The tension between curiosity and certainty had not yet resolved, but resolution was coming. In the final years of the 4th century, Alexandria balanced on a knife's edge. Christians filled basilicas with chants of victory. Pagans clung to their gods in dwindling sanctuaries. Jewish communities struggled to survive between two giants. The Serapeum's walls sheltered texts that had survived fire and centuries of neglect. But its fate now depended not on kings or scholars, but on mobs in the street and emperors in distant Constantinople. The rise of Christianity in Alexandria was not gentle. It was storm, riot, upheaval. It transformed the city from haven of pluralism into battlefield of belief. And as the faith claimed temples, toppled statues, and silenced rival voices, it prepared to strike the last great blow against the Serapeum itself, guardian of memory, keeper of fragments, shadow of the greatest library the world had ever known. The wind off the harbour carries hymns instead of hymns to Isis. Voices lifted not to Serapis, but to Christ. By the 4th century AD, Alexandria, once the greatest city of the Hellenistic world, has become one of Christianity's strongest bastions. Temples still stand. Statues still gleam under desert sun. The Serapeum still crowns its hill. Yet in the streets below, crosses outnumber idols, and the rhythm of the city's life beats to new prayers. Christianity had arrived in Alexandria early, carried by sailors, merchants, and exiles from Judea. In a city already accustomed to blending gods, philosophies, and traditions, the new faith found fertile ground. Some Jews embraced it, seeing in Christ the fulfillment of ancient law. Some Greeks found in it a purity lacking in the philosophical schools. Egyptians, weary of rulers who spoke foreign tongues, found hope in a God who preached to slaves and peasants as much as to kings. By the 2nd century, Alexandria was not only a city of philosophers, but also of bishops, not only of scholars, but of martyrs. Its Christian teachers were formidable. Clement of Alexandria, born in Athens but settled by the Nile, sought to reconcile Greek philosophy with the gospel. To him, truth was not divided. Plato's wisdom could serve Christ as well as Aristotle's logic. He lectured in halls where once students had passed Homer, urging them to see the Logos, divine reason, as the thread linking Hellenic thought to Christian revelation. His work spread far, showing that Alexandria was more than birthplace of heresies. It was also a forge of synthesis. After Clement came Origen, whose genius astonished even his opponents. Barely 17 when he began teaching, he combined encyclopedic learning with a fierce devotion to scripture. He studied Hebrew texts alongside Greek translations, produced commentaries that filled volumes, and speculated boldly on creation, salvation, and the soul. To some, he was a saint of intellect. To others, a dangerous innovator. His writings shaped Christianity across centuries, influencing East and West alike. But even his brilliance bore the marks of Alexandria's library, the hunger to preserve, to harmonize, to explain. Origen embodied the city's restless fusion of faith and inquiry. Yet harmony was fragile. Alexandria was never a quiet city, and in religion, as in politics, its passions burned hotter than most. Pagan devotees saw in Christianity an enemy of their gods. Jewish communities, long established, felt threatened by a faith that claimed to supersede their law, and Christians themselves fractured into sects, each proclaiming its interpretation of Scripture as truth. Arians argued against the divinity of Christ. Athanasians defended it. Gnostics spun cosmologies that blurred myth with theology. The streets rang with debates as fierce as any sword clash, and sometimes debates ended in blood. The library and Serapeum stood in the midst of this turmoil, like fortresses of memory, reminders of a world where inquiry had been shielded by kings rather than torn by sects. To Christian leaders, these institutions were ambiguous. On one hand, they preserved texts of philosophy and science that could be turned toward the faith. On the other, they sheltered pagan lies, the works of philosophers who denied revelation, priests who worshipped idols, astrologers who read stars instead of scripture. Some bishops tolerated the libraries as useful, others denounced them as demonic. As Christianity grew, its relationship with classical learning shifted. Early teachers like Clement and Origen embraced philosophy as ally. Later leaders grew more suspicious. Why study Euclid when scripture was sufficient? Why preserve Aristotle when prophets had spoken? The very methods of the library, collection, comparison, questioning, seemed to some like snares of the devil, temptations to wander from revelation into doubt. Faith demanded certainty. Scholarship thrived on questions. Their coexistence grew uneasy. Meanwhile, the city's crowds lent their weight to the contest. In Alexandria, religion was not confined to temples or churches. It spilled into markets, docks, and squares. Mobs gathered behind priests and bishops as readily as behind generals. When passions flared, riots erupted. Statues were toppled, Shrines desecrated, synagogues burned. Authority shifted from governor to bishop, from emperor's representative to Christ's shepherd. The balance of power tilted, and the keepers of old gods began to feel cornered. The Serapeum became focal point of this tension. To pagans, it was last stronghold of their gods, their library, their heritage. To Christians, it was rival altar, symbol of superstition that must yield to the cross. As congregations swelled, as bishops thundered sermons against idols, pressure mounted. The sanctuary that had once been refuge for books and rituals now stood as fortress of resistance, and therefore as target. Imperial politics accelerated the change. Constantine the Great's conversion in the early 4th century gave Christianity legal standing across the empire. Temples were not yet outlawed, but the wind shifted. Funding flowed to churches, bishops gained influence, and Christian congregations multiplied. Alexandria, already a center of Christian teaching, surged with new confidence. Pagan priests sensed the ground slipping beneath them. Their processions grew more defiant, their defenses more desperate. By the time Theodosius I issued decrees against pagan worship in the late 4th century, the stage was set. Christianity was no longer one sect among many. It was the empire's official faith. Temples closed, sacrifices banned, idols condemned. In Alexandria, these edicts fell like thunder. For centuries, the city had thrived on diversity, its identity woven from Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Roman threads. Now, uniformity was demanded, and tolerance narrowed to a blade's edge. For the library and Serapeum, this shift was perilous. They embodied a world of plurality. Philosophers beside priests, astrologers beside physicians, Homer beside Moses. To a faith that sought purity, such coexistence looked like corruption. Christian mobs, emboldened by bishops and imperial law, began to target pagan sanctuaries. Smaller temples fell first, their statues shattered, their altars repurposed. Each fall brought the Serapeum closer to the edge, and yet, for a time, the books endured. Even as zealots stormed shrines, scribes still copied manuscripts by lamplight. Even as bishops thundered against idolatry, physicians consulted ancient texts to treat illness. Even as mobs shouted for idols to fall, philosophers debated in quiet corners of the city. The tension between curiosity and certainty had not yet resolved, but resolution was coming. In the final years of the 4th century, Alexandria balanced on a knife's edge. Christians filled basilicas with chants of victory. Pagans clung to their gods in dwindling sanctuaries. Jewish communities struggled to survive between two giants. The Serapeum's walls sheltered texts that had survived fire and centuries of neglect. But its fate now depended not on kings or scholars, but on mobs in the street and emperors in distant Constantinople. The rise of Christianity in Alexandria was not gentle. It was storm, riot, upheaval. It transformed the city from haven of pluralism into battlefield of belief. And as the faith claimed temples, toppled statues, and silenced rival voices, it prepared to strike the last great blow against the Serapeum itself, guardian of memory, keeper of fragments, shadow of the greatest library the world had ever known. In Alexandria, the markets surge with clamor, though behind the noise coils a tension as dangerous as a drawn blade. In this year, 415 AD, the city is less the beacon of knowledge it once was, and more a battlefield of belief. Pagan sanctuaries lie in ruins. Jewish communities face hostility, and Christians themselves are split by rival factions. Amid the turmoil, one figure still embodies the city's ancient dream of learning. She is Hypatia, daughter of Theon, last mathematician to serve the fading library. Raised among scrolls and constellations, she learned to chart the heavens as naturally as others learned prayer. Geometry became her language, astronomy her horizon, philosophy her calling. Unlike queens or priestesses, her power came not from birth or ritual, but from wisdom itself. The philosopher taught openly in colonnades where once poets recited Homer. Crowds gathered as she explained conic sections, planetary motions, and Platonic ideals with a clarity that silenced skeptics. Her classrooms drew young men from every corner of the empire, pagans longing for a remnant of their traditions, Christians searching for intellectual depth, even imperial officials eager to temper politics with philosophy. In her presence, inquiry still lived, fragile but unbroken. Still, influence made her vulnerable. Archbishop Cyril, iron-willed leader of Alexandria's Christians, saw in her more than a teacher. She was ally to Orestes, the prefect who resisted his dominance. To the bishop's supporters, this scholar became symbol of opposition, a woman who dared to rival a shepherd of the church in authority. Whisperers spread rumors. She practiced sorcery. She ensnared men with magic. Her geometry masked pagan rites. Lies sharpened into weapons, and weapons awaited the moment to strike. Still, the mathematician continued her work. She refined instruments for measuring stars, devised hydrometers for liquids, and wrote treatises on geometry that extended Euclid's legacy. Fragments survive in the writings of her students, proof that she pushed the boundaries of science even as politics closed around her. She did not yield to fear. In her lectures, reason still triumphed, if only for an hour. But mobs do not measure time in reason. One March morning, as her chariot rattled through the streets, she was dragged to the ground by men sworn as Christian caregivers, but notorious as zealots. They carried the teacher into a church, not for debate, but for death. There, amid holy chants, violence replaced prayer. Blades or shards, sources differ, tore her body apart. What remained was burned outside the city, as though Alexandria itself sought to erase its conscience. The murder echoed far beyond Egypt. Pagan writers decried it as proof of barbarism. Some Christians recoiled in shame, though others defended the act as necessary purge. Yet beneath debate lay the irreversible truth. The last public philosopher of Alexandria was gone. With her ended a tradition that reached back to the Ptolemies, to Euclid, to the golden age when questions mattered more than creeds. Her students dispersed. A few carried her teachings to Athens, where a frail academy struggled on. Others retreated into monastic communities, preserving fragments of her commentary. Some dared remain in the city, but never spoke with her authority. Where once Alexandria attracted the world's minds, now it silenced its own. The library had burned, the Serapeum had fallen, and now philosophy itself had been murdered in human form. The scholar's memory, however, refused burial. For centuries, her name lingered like ghost light. Chroniclers invoked her as symbol of lost wisdom. Legends claimed her astrolabes inspired later astronomers. Thinkers who valued inquiry honored her as martyr, not for faith, but for reason. She became less woman than warning. What happens when zeal silences the search for truth? Alexandria, once the city of questions, had chosen answers imposed by force. Scrolls had turned to ash, statues to rubble, and now its last great teacher to dust. With her, the ancient dream dimmed. The flame still flickered in distant lands, in Athens, later in Constantinople, soon in Baghdad. But by the Nile, it had gone out. At sunset, one can imagine her classroom abandoned, wax tablets unmarked, manuscripts scattered, instruments unused. Outside, mobs celebrated triumph of faith. Inside, silence reigned. The final lesson of the daughter of Theon was not a theorem or a star chart, but her death itself. Civilization falters when knowledge becomes enemy, when questions invite blades, when wisdom is seen as threat. Her story endures not as victory, but as warning. The fall of Alexandria's last philosopher was the fall of an age, a reminder etched not in papyrus but in memory, that when inquiry dies, so too does the greatness of a civilization. The desert wind carries the sound of hoofbeats toward the Nile. By the middle of the 7th century, Alexandria, battered by centuries of turmoil, finds itself once again in the path of empire. Pagan shrines have fallen, philosophers silenced, scrolls scattered. Yet the city still gleams, its lighthouse guiding ships, its markets bustling with trade, its scholars whispering in corners of monasteries. And then, in 642 AD, new banners appear on the horizon, green standards of Islam, borne by Arab armies under the command of Amr ibn al-As, general of Caliph Umar. Egypt falls quickly, its Byzantine garrisons breaking, before cavalry tempered by long years in the desert. Peasants, weary of heavy taxation, offer little resistance. Monks and villagers watch silently as a new faith sweeps across the land. Alexandria, jewel of the coast, holds out longest. Its walls, strengthened by centuries of conflict, resist siege after siege, but hunger breaks where steel cannot. Eventually, gates open, and the city of Alexander passes into Arab hands. What happens next has been debated for over 1,000 years. Some chronicles tell of a final catastrophe, a second fire that consumed what remained of the library. They claim that when Amr consulted the caliph about the fate of Alexandria's books, Umar replied, "If they agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Burn them." According to this tradition, scrolls were distributed to bathhouses across the city, their papyrus used as fuel until nothing remained. For 6 months, fires warmed water with the ashes of centuries. Historians argue, many say by the time Arabs entered the city, the library no longer existed in any recognizable form. Caesar's flames, Roman neglect, sectarian riots, and the Serapeum's destruction had already erased most of its treasures. What remained were fragments, scrolls in private hands, codices in monasteries, commentaries scattered across the empire. The story of bathhouse fires, some suggest, was invention of later centuries, a legend woven by enemies of Islam to dramatize what had already been lost. Still, the legend persists, perhaps because it is too fitting, too poetic. The idea that the last embers of the world's greatest collection warmed bathwater seems both grotesque and inevitable, a final indignity to knowledge already betrayed. Whether truth or myth, it symbolizes the fragility of memory, the ease with which centuries of brilliance can vanish when power shifts and priorities change. For the conquerors, Alexandria was not city of scrolls, but city of grain and trade. The lighthouse served as beacon for fleets carrying taxes to Damascus. The markets funneled wealth across the Mediterranean. As long as food and gold flowed, manuscripts mattered little. The age when kings measured their prestige in books had ended long before Islam's arrival. Armies cared not for catalogues. Governors demanded tribute, not texts. And yet, paradox endures. While the city may have lost its library, the civilization rising in its place would soon preserve and expand the very heritage Alexandria had sought to gather. Within a century, Baghdad's House of Wisdom would translate Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian science into Arabic. rescuing fragments that might otherwise have vanished entirely. The dream of universal knowledge shifted eastward, reborn in a new language and under a new faith. Alexandria fell silent, but its vision found heirs. For Alexandrians who lived through conquest, however, such consolation was distant. They saw soldiers, not scribes. They heard new prayers rising from mosques, not lectures echoing through colonnades. They felt the absence of what once was, the gap where memory had stood. Even if the scrolls had already disappeared, the idea of the library haunted them. To walk past the ruins of the Serapeum was to walk past a grave. To hear stories of vanished books was to hear laments for a civilization that had chosen certainty over inquiry, zeal over preservation. Legends multiplied. Some whispered that hidden chambers still sheltered manuscripts beneath Alexandria's streets. Others claimed monks carried the last treasures into desert monasteries. A few insisted scrolls had traveled by caravan to Persia, India, or beyond. None could prove it. Hope, like ash, scattered on the wind. By the time Arab rule settled into routine, the library had become more myth than fact. Scholars spoke of it with longing. Travelers recorded tales colored by imagination. Poets lamented its fall in verse. The reality, whether gradual erosion or sudden destruction, mattered less than the symbol. Humanity remembered not specific scrolls, but the idea of a place where all knowledge was once gathered and then lost. That memory, stronger than stone, outlasted every dynasty. Alexandria itself adapted. Under Muslim rule, it remained vital port and fortress, though political power shifted inland to Fustat and later Cairo. The lighthouse stood for centuries more, battered by earthquakes but still guiding ships. Churches, synagogues, and mosques shared the city, sometimes in fragile peace, often in tension. But never again would Alexandria claim to be the capital of learning. The dream had migrated, and with it, the future. Looking back, the Arab conquest is less the cause of the library's loss than its final punctuation. The scrolls had already suffered Caesar's fire, Roman neglect, Christian zeal, and the Serapeum's destruction. What the Arabs found was, at best, fragments. Yet legend places the blame here, perhaps because human memory seeks a dramatic end. Better to imagine a single bonfire than to admit a slower tragedy, centuries long, in which knowledge slipped away piece by piece. In truth, the day of final loss cannot be dated. It came in waves, a ship fire in Caesar's time, riots under Theophilus, axes that shattered Serapis, the mob that murdered Hypatia, and at last the conquest that sealed Alexandria's fate. The library did not die in one night, but in many. And yet, in the popular mind, the Arab conquest became the symbol of its end, the final act in a tragedy stretching across a millennium. On the harbour, waves crash against stone quays, carrying whispers of vanished words. Sailors haul nets heavy with fish, indifferent to ghosts of manuscripts. Merchants shout prices for grain, their voices drowning memory of philosophers. Children play where once scholars debated. Life continues, but beneath it lingers absence. The city endures, but the dream is gone. Thus, Alexandria, once the mind of the ancient world, passes into history as ordinary city, great port, proud relic, but no longer the home of all knowledge. The Arab banners mark not merely political conquest, but symbolic finality. Whatever fragments survived now belonged to the scattered winds of history. The library was not burned once, but many times, not destroyed by one hand, but by many, by fire, by neglect, by zealotry, by conquest. And so, whether in bathhouses or battlefields, whether slowly forgotten or suddenly incinerated, the last illusion of immortality ended here, on the shores of Egypt, under a new empire's rising sun. Smoke rises in memory, long after the flames are gone. Alexandria is quiet now, its streets filled with ordinary life, merchants shouting in markets, ships docking in the harbour, priests chanting in churches and mosques. Yet beneath the hum of survival lies absence. The great library, once imagined as humanity's immortal memory, is no more. Its halls stand only in imagination, its shelves recalled only in fragments. The day knowledge died did not come in a single night of fire, but in waves across centuries, each destruction deeper than the last. The tragedy began with ambition. Ptolemy I dreamed of making his kingdom not merely strong, but eternal, securing Alexander's body and building a city where all wisdom could dwell. His successors expanded the vision, confiscating scrolls from ships, borrowing manuscripts from Athens, employing scribes and philosophers to preserve the world's thought. For centuries, it worked. Astronomers measured the earth, physicians mapped the body, poets refined the art of language. The library became humanity's audacious wager against oblivion. But ambition also bred fragility. Knowledge bound to kings depended on their whims. When rulers lost interest, funding waned. When wars erupted, scrolls burned. When religion demanded purity, books became enemies. The library lived not in stone or papyrus alone, but in the choices of those who ruled and those who resisted. And choices, as history shows, are rarely kind to memory. Caesar's fire in 48 BC delivered the first wound. Whether 40,000 scrolls or more, the loss scarred the institution forever. Scholars rebuilt, but the illusion of permanence had shattered. Later, neglect under Rome allowed manuscripts to wither. The Serapeum rose as Second Heart, only to be destroyed under Theophilus's mobs in 391 AD. Hypatia's murder in 415 extinguished the last living voice of classical philosophy in Alexandria. Finally, the Arab conquest, whether through mythic bathhouse fires or simple neglect, marked the symbolic end. By then, little may have remained. Yet legend insists on one last act of erasure, because humans seek a final chapter even when tragedy is slow. What was lost? Lists have been drawn. The full plays of Sophocles, treatises of Aristarchus proving the earth orbits the sun, Herophilus's notes on surgery centuries ahead of their time, records of vanished civilizations, maps of lands unknown. But the truth is larger. What vanished was not only specific works but possibilities, paths not taken, discoveries delayed by centuries, 1,000 questions asked once and never answered again. We cannot measure what the flames consumed, because we cannot measure what humanity might have become had it read what was burned. Some argue that knowledge is never truly lost, that ideas resurface in new forms, in new languages, and indeed, fragments survived. Texts preserved in monasteries, translated into Syriac, Arabic, Latin. Echoes of Alexandrian science traveled east, where the House of Wisdom in Baghdad nurtured them, then returned centuries later to Europe, sparking the Renaissance. The dream did not vanish entirely. It migrated. But migration is not the same as continuity. Much that was once written is gone forever, leaving only silence where voices should be. The image of Alexandria burning has haunted imagination for 2 millennia. Writers speak of it as civilization's darkest night, poets as humanity's original sin against itself. Whether exaggerated or not, the symbol endures. The library is remembered less for what it preserved than for what it lost. It stands as warning that human progress is not inevitable, that brilliance can vanish, that ignorance armed with zeal is stronger than parchment armed with ink. The day knowledge died was not a single event. It was a pattern. Fire fed by ambition, then by accident, then by neglect, then by faith turned violent. Each generation made its choice, sometimes to preserve, more often to destroy. The responsibility lies not with Caesar alone, nor Theophilus, nor Cyril, nor Umar, but with humanity itself. The library's death was not murder by one man, but by centuries of indifference, arrogance, and fear. And yet, its ghost endures. Every modern library, every archive, every database owes something to Alexandria's audacity. The very idea that all knowledge might be gathered in one place still inspires, even if it proved impossible. The vision survives as challenge, not to repeat the mistake of binding wisdom to fragile walls or to the whims of kings and mobs, but to share it, preserve it, multiply it beyond the reach of fire. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, one imagines the city as it once was, ships unloading manuscripts into warehouses, scribes bent over fresh papyrus, philosophers arguing in colonnades, students marveling at teachers who measured the earth itself. And then one imagines the silence that followed, the hollow halls, the broken statues, the ashes scattered by wind. The contrast is unbearable, yet it is precisely this contrast that gives the library its immortal place in human memory. Alexandria's dream was magnificent, audacious, doomed. But in its failure, it taught the world a lesson deeper than any scroll, that knowledge must be guarded not only from flames but from neglect, not only from zealots but from indifference. Its loss carved a scar across history, but scars remind us of wounds survived. The day knowledge died was also the day humanity began to understand how fragile wisdom is, how easily memory burns, how necessary preservation remains. The dream may have turned to ash, but its echo still calls us to gather, to protect, to learn. That is the legacy of the greatest library ever built. And so, though Alexandria's shelves are gone, its idea remains, enduring, urgent, unfinished.